I'm Hans Neve, and I beat the often path by starting a company called Carbyon to take CO2 back from the atmosphere and undo the climate change.
Welcome back to the Beat the Often Path podcast. I'm your host, Ross Palmer. On this show, we showcase unusual success stories, often with an eco-friendly slant to help us think outside the box in our lives and careers. Well, my guest today is Hans de Neve, and he's tackling an unsolvable problem, capturing CO2 from the air. Today, we discuss how going against conventional wisdom and the advice of his peers in the scientific community has led him to a breakthrough technology that could help us all pull carbon from the air and even maybe reverse climate change at scale. But it's no pipe dream. He's already received the prestigious XPRIZE Milestone Award, that's from Elon Musk, with his company Carbyon, and his work towards helping us achieve not just zero emissions, but actually negative emissions couldn't be more important to our species as a whole. So I can't wait for you to meet Hans de Neve right now of Carbyon. Well, welcome to the show, Hans, and I have a very special thing for you to say. First of all, can we all agree Eindhoven de gekste?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, Eindhoven is a place where we work, and it's a great place.
It is a great place. I actually lived there for 5 years. I don't know if you knew that about me. I lived in Eindhoven specifically for an extended period of time.
Okay, no, I didn't know that. I don't need to tell you then all about Eindhoven. That's
No, it's
me
a
a
great
lot of
place.
time.
It's at the time I was there, it was named the smartest region. You are a part of the Brainport region, of course. They got a lot smarter after I left, but that's neither here nor there.
No,
But
it's still a very smart region, and it attracts a lot of people from all over the world, I should say, also from the US, because you've been there, obviously, and I think it's an inspiring place. Yeah.
it really is. It's very modern. A lot of great things happening there. There's the Stripe S region, a lot of focus on small businesses. They make it very easy for startups and companies to get started and to operate. It's a very good environment to have big ideas, I think. And those ideas are often celebrated, and there's a lot of avenues to get your ideas out there. That was my experience.
No, it's true.
How do you feel? So maybe tell us a little bit about your background. So what is your company doing and why, and how did you get on this path?
And so the company, we're developing a machine that can extract CO2 from the atmosphere and do it at gigaton scale. So really to undo climate change, let's say, to undo what we've been doing wrong for the past 150 years. Of course, we've been emitting a huge amount of CO2, and we're experiencing the consequences right now. And actually, we have the plan to undo that. So to develop a technology that allows to reduce the atmospheric concentrations of CO2, and it's a kind of a daunting plan because I've met much more people that declared me completely crazy of wanting to do it, and I must say that I'm a scientist myself, and but most scientists actually are convinced that it's impossible to do. I've been thinking about this idea for a long time, and people have literally told me, okay, give it a try, but you know what? It will never work. So people, scientific people were really convinced, and the whole scientific community actually, and that's also the link I think to this program, that many people were afraid to start thinking and working on this topic because they were afraid that they would be laughed at by the so-called serious scientific community, because there was this kind of common knowledge, let's say, among serious scientists that we should never work on, or we should never even try to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, because it will always be taking too much energy, much more energy than we could ever generate, let's say. It would cost too much material, it would be too costly, it would never be economic, so etc., etc. There were always arguments why the serious scientific community thought that it was not worth investigating, and that's really a pity, because I think if more people would have left the beaten path before on this topic, maybe we would have been further in developing technology. Because right now, 2022, I think many people that say 10 years ago or 20 years ago said that it was not possible to do. Today, they see that with technology, as technology advances, and they think that, okay, maybe we were wrong and maybe it is possible. It's not yet proven, but what the message is that sometimes we need to, yeah, leave the beaten path more often and do some crazy stuff.
Well, that's a great message. And one of the phrases that you have on your website is irrational optimism. You say, I wouldn't have achieved at this without irrational optimism. There is that debate, isn't there, between what is optimism and what is irrational. Do you feel at this point that it is irrational, as in illogical, to do this? Or do you think that there is a chance of this being a viable method based on what you know now?
There is truly a chance for this viable method. In that sense, it's not irrational. But if you look at the path that we followed, so where we started 3 years ago, back then it was pretty irrational to believe that we could actually do that. In a way, when we did the first experiments, things looked good. And I was so enthusiastic that I wanted to continue on that track. About 1 year later, it turned out that none of these experiments were true. So we started the company Carbyon based on a kind of false positive result. And in that sense, of course, looking back now to the moment that I decided to start Carbyon, it was pretty irrational because we hadn't checked on the measurements, which turned out to be wrong afterwards. So starting a company and not double checking your measurements first, that was a pretty irrational thing to do. But okay, we got lucky. I mean, despite the fact that these initial measurements were wrong, we finally proved them. We did other measurements and we found another way of proving this idea. But sometimes you need to do things without having double checked or triple checked things. And in that way, it was a little bit irrational, because a rational person would say, no, before I quit my job, I'm going to double check and triple check whether these results are okay and whether people will be willing to pay for it and all of these things. I checked none of these things because there was no time. I had to take a decision and I had to say, okay, we need to decide with little information. We had little technical information. We had no information about the market. So we had very little to take. I mean, we had no certainties, right? And that's what it is in life. I mean, you always need to take a decision, and you don't know if you take the left turn or the right turn. I mean, I could have stayed at the institute where I was working. I was working for a research institute. I had a nice job. I had everything I wanted, if you want, and I could stay there till I was retired. And then nobody would push me out there. So that was kind of the certainty. But then I also knew that I could not do this dream that we're doing right now with Carbyon. I could not actually develop this technology because they didn't see any value in it, and they said it was impossible to do, and they wouldn't then spend any money on it. So the alternative was to go for the uncertainty. And the fact that I had to quit my job. I didn't know how things would work out. I wasn't sure about the technology, so it was full of uncertainties. And that's always a difficult moment to decide upon. But then I thought, like, if I don't do it, I'm going to regret it my whole life. So I choose for the uncertain route, following my dream, leaving the beaten path, let's say, leaving the certain path, and trying to see what's out there in the desert. And of course, you need to have a hinge, you need to have some idea what you're looking for. So you're not just going out in the desert based on good luck. We had some idea, of course, what we were looking for, but still, when you're leaving the beaten path, it's like, okay, nobody has digged there. We think we can find something there, and that takes some guts, of course, but it's also part of the adventure, and that's really nice about it.
That's really a beautiful sentiment. And that is, of course, what this show is all about. And I think you've touched on a couple points of people who think that they know things. And I think there are two kinds of people who think that they know things. There are people who just deny climate change. They say it doesn't exist or it's not man-made. It's a normal process that the Earth goes through every so many thousands of years. There's nothing to worry about. There's nothing we can do about it. There are a lot of people who think that they know that. I believe that they're wrong. I think most intelligent people know that they're wrong or believe that. But then you have another category of, like you said, the scientists, the serious scientific community, who's quite sure that they know that it is a man-made problem, but they also know that it can't be solved, so why even try? Both of those are dangerous because both of those lead to the thought of inactivity, inaction, why bother? Let's just not do anything at all, right?
Yeah, it's both are dangerous, as you say. The also scientists that do not even try to figure out certain technologies like capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. Klaus Lackner, a U.S. Professor, he was the first actually to start publishing about the fact that it should be feasible. But he was the only one. This was 20 years ago. And he wrote these articles that he said, okay, everybody says it can't be done, but I think it can be done. And this is the reason why I think it can be done. But he was not believed. He was put aside by his colleagues and he remained the only person for a very, very long time. So yeah, that's how scientific community also works. There are too many beaten paths and people are afraid to leave those beaten paths. If you're working on a PhD, I see people choosing too many safe topics, topics that already thousands of people have worked upon, and then they add a small part to that. So that's safe because you remain on the, let's say, in what is acknowledged by the scientific community as a relevant domain of research. But as soon as you do something which is completely different, that nobody has yet done before or nobody has even published about before, nobody dares that. I mean, and also if you're working on a PhD and that's what you propose, you will not find easily a promoter that will support you on that. And I think that's really a pity. The scientific community stays too much within what they believe themselves to be relevant domains, and fail sometimes to start exploring something completely different. And it's a rare event that people start to research from completely new and undiscovered domains.
And you mentioned wandering out in the desert, but you had some hints. So let's talk about the why and the how. Why did you decide to, not having all of the information, go after this problem? And how did you get started day one when you took the leap?
So I've been following the domain already for the past 10 to 15 years. Working as an engineer and a scientist on energy transition, I was always I was very much interested in the technology to turn renewable electricity into renewable fuels. And somehow with electricity as the prime source of energy through solar panels and through wind turbines, electricity is not easy to store. We can do it in batteries, but that only works to a certain extent. And I was actually on a Christmas lecture hearing about the possibility that you can transform electricity into fuels like hydrogen, but also the combination of hydrogen and carbon into hydrocarbons. And in a way, you can make jet fuel based on electricity. So chemically, the same thing as the fossil jet fuel, you can make it from electricity based on hydrogen and based on carbon. And that source of carbon had to be a renewable source, so it had to come from air, which is then CO2. That was actually the trigger for me 10 years ago to start thinking more about this. And I started reading everything I could. And it was clear that in particular the CO2 from air was an under-investigated domain. And it never left my mind. I didn't start working explicitly on this domain. I've been working mainly on smart grids and solar panels. But it was like 5 years ago when working on solar panels, we had this technical solution for solar panels, which was the ability to deposit some atomic monolayers that actually made me realize that we could also use that technique to revolutionize the area of direct air capture, so capturing CO2 from air. But I was in a solar panel team, and of course the people from solar panels, I mean, they had no clue about CO2 and capturing it from the atmosphere. So they said, maybe you're right, but we're not going to work on that. But it's exactly that cross-domain thinking, the fact that it had been working in different domains like hydrogen and CO2 and solar panels, that allowed me to make that connection. Because if I had been working, let's say, on solar panels all my life, I would never have made the link, of course, with capturing CO2. And that's another advice I have for people. Make sure that you do different stuff. Don't stay your whole life in one technical domain. It's the cross-domain thinking that really leads to true innovation.
Such a great point. So you recognize that you could capture carbon in this way, and now you've created a device that's kind of, funnily enough, almost looks like a cigarette in a weird way, but a much more modern version. It's a sort of silo with a spinning internal component. How did you land on that design to achieve this at scale?
Yeah, it was based on some brainstorming we did with a couple of people to see how it could look like. We wanted to have a continuous process, and that's how we came with moving the sorbent in a continuous way. The most elegant way seemed to be a rotating drum. So to give the sorbent the shape of a rotating drum. And that's how we came to the idea of a cylinder. So indeed, it looks a bit like like a chimney, if you want, but then it's a reverse chimney, so it takes in ambient air,
right,
and it will filter out the CO2. But of course, the idea has taken shape over the course of many months. So this was not, of course, a one-day idea like this is how it's going to look like. But yeah, more and more it took shape, and we still think it's a great idea.
And you mentioned fuel. What are you going to do with what you capture? Is fuel something that you're still thinking about, turning this carbon into hydrocarbons, or how do you dispose of the carbon? I guess I'm really not familiar with that side of the process.
So making fuels out of carbon, it's a kind of replacement of fossil fuels. So in a way, that's a technology that allows to reduce emissions, because you will no longer need fossil oil and gas. You can just make it from renewable electricity. So that's a way to avoid emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. But it's not a negative emission technology. Yes, this is just a zero emission technology, if you want. But it is a zero emission technology for which there is a huge demand, because more and more people are convinced that we need, of course, to stop using fossil oil and gas, but we cannot all replace that with electrical batteries. We will need, like for aviation and some other sectors, still a hydrocarbon, be it jet fuel or something else. So if we can turn electricity into green electricity into green fuels, you can actually serve these domains like aviation without the need of using fossil oil and gas. So there is a business case, there are customers that want to do that, that want to buy our machines, etc. So that's a good thing. Of course, what we also will need to do as humanity is we will need to take CO2 back from the atmosphere and keep it out of the atmosphere. So not make fuel with it, but storing it underground or doing something that it cannot come back in the atmosphere. So that's called negative emissions, and so far nobody is willing to pay for that. It will be more of a UN debate probably, that the countries that are responsible for the historical emissions will have to finance also undoing those emissions. But right now you will not find anyone that is willing to pay for doing negative emissions. The only thing that people want is to compensate their own emissions, so to become carbon neutral. So there is, of course, a huge opportunity for becoming carbon neutral. And that can be done with green fuels, that can be done in various ways. So I think business-wise, these will be, of course, our first customers. But I hope in the end that we will also get an agreement on who will finance the negative emission part so that we can also undo climate change.
And you mentioned earlier about the electricity required. How much electricity? I know that that's something that you're working on. You're working on making it more efficient. You're working on making the costs better all the time, I'm sure. How much electricity do these things need to run? Do you envision them in specific locations or just scattered throughout the earth? How should they be powered? What does that look like?
Most of them will be powered by dedicated wind farms or solar farms. In particular in those regions where you have abundant wind and sun conditions. Sometimes indeed the argument is used like, okay, we have so few green electricity that should we then also use it to capture CO2 from air? The fact is that if we have the ability to capture CO2 from air, automatically new wind farms and new solar farms will be built that otherwise would not be built. And the same goes for the fuels. People built dedicated wind farms to make green fuels. And if there was no business case for green fuels, these wind farms would not be built. So it's not in competition, let's say, with other wind farms or other green electricity. It's clear, of course, that we will need to build a lot of wind farms, a lot of solar farms, much more than we have today. And if we want to have all the energy that we use today, and do it based on wind and solar, obviously we need 10 times more at least than what we have today. But hey, it's a matter of time. It's for sure feasible. There is enough energy in terms of wind and solar on Earth by far. We have 10 times more than we need every year. So it's a matter of building these installations. It's for sure a feasible thing to do, even though today maybe we haven't progressed very far. We're only covering maybe 5 to 10%, but that's a matter of time. That's a transition that we're going through. And energy is not so much the concern. There is plenty of energy. We just need to harvest it.
Yeah. And that is something that we all have to wrap our heads around because we come from this fossil fuel mindset. I just recently read an article about somebody who installed solar panels on their roof, and those solar panels were able to meet more than 100% of their total energy demand. And they said it took a while to completely redefine how they thought about their energy usage, because before they would be very afraid to have the air conditioner on all day or the air conditioner plus some other appliances. And then once they learned that it didn't matter, that the sun was blasting on their house anyways, they said, I can run the air conditioner all day, I can have my appliances running, and I still never exceed. I can charge my car, I can charge my e-bike. All of these things are happening from this free energy that we're capturing. And this person who wrote the article described it as a personal revolution and being an incredibly freeing thing, because we're stuck in these old mental models of energy is expensive and energy is finite. That makes it hard for us to see that an inefficiency, like you said, could not matter if we have enough and it's abundant as it is, which it seems like it should be.
Yeah, of course, you should not spoil energy, but we should not be afraid of using energy or trying to, for example, aviation is a hard to abate sector. So you could argue that, okay, as long as we cannot fly one of those airplanes on batteries, we don't fly. I think that's, anyway, from a societal point of view, it's a very difficult thing to do. It's kind of when I look at society, when I look at people around me, I just realize, like, you can't revolutionize things. You cannot close down all the airports. You can't. You will get a revolution. People will be upset about that. You will disrupt so many things. So what we need to do is to make sure that, of course, society as it is can continue to evolve in a rather, let's say, evolutionary way. But that, of course, we change, for example, the fuels from fossil fuels to green fuels. But we keep using fuels. Why not? If it's appropriate to use fuels, use fuels. It's just, it's a chemical. You only need to make sure that it's not heating up the atmosphere. And if you make the chemical based on CO2 that you get from the atmosphere in the first place, well, it will not heat up the atmosphere. So these are smart things that we can do to make sure that people can continue their lives and society can continue to evolve without disrupting anything. Because I mean, disrupting society for the sake of saving the planet, it's not going to work. If we need to save the planet by means of a societal disruption, I think it's going to be a disaster. We need to save the planet, but we need to do it without disrupting society.
At the very beginning, we talked about how you had a stable job, and people who don't live in Europe or the Netherlands, they don't understand exactly what that means. Because in the Netherlands, you can get what's called a permanent contract. You can have a job, and you truly have that job for life. It is very, very difficult to fire somebody who has a permanent contract, very difficult to get rid of them. It's not like here in the United States where somebody can work for your company for 30 years and you say, okay, pack up your stuff and you're out of here in 5 minutes. We don't care what you did. So it means more, I believe, to leave the safe path in an environment like that, where, like you said, it truly was safe for life. You could have retired, you could have followed down that path, and you would have been totally fine. And it takes initiative and risk and guts to leave that to do this. Now that you're on the other side, admitting that you jumped into it not having all the facts right, not having all of the information that you needed, now that you did that, how do you feel at this point in the process? Any regrets? Are you completely happy? How's your day-to-day? Are you full of more stress, more joy?
I'm happier than ever. Once you cross, you discover a new continent, so to say, the continent of entrepreneurs, and I'm so. I mean, of course, there is stress, but there is also stress in large corporates where you need to do what higher management is telling you to do, and you need to meet your milestones there as well. So that also creates stress. But this is stress that you impose on yourself, and that's something else. We're a startup company. We're 15 people. So we decide among ourselves, of course, the type of challenges that we want to engage on. Do we want to do the XPRIZE or do we not want to do the XPRIZE? It's only us deciding on that. It's not anyone imposing that on us, and the freedom that you experience to make your own decisions is actually a great thing to do. It's what I discovered doing this now the past 3 years. I have no regrets whatsoever. I would do it again, and probably I should have done it sooner. But okay, I've done it now. I started doing this 3 years, and I'm sure that this is exactly what I want to continue doing. There is no way I want to go back to a big corporate. This is way too fun.
Yeah, that's you summed it up so nicely. And you touch on a point that I hadn't thought of before, but it does seem true that there are two types of stress. You talk about self-imposed versus external, and we know, especially in Europe, it's a topic that's been talked about a lot the last 10 years, the concept of burnout and this kind of external stress, this work-related stress that we know if you have too much of it, it's very, very negative. And I think anybody who's worked in a corporate environment or anybody who's worked in a traditional job knows that level of stress, especially if there's a lot being asked of them. But then there's this other stress, which is the performing on stage stress, or the winning a competition stress, or the beating your own milestone stress, or those kind of self-imposed stresses that you talk about, which seems to me to be a good thing. It seems to me to be a
Yeah.
positive thing, because without any of the good stress, there's no joy. What's the point of waking up every morning if there's not something that's a little bit of excitement or something of a little bit of unknown? And maybe we haven't really categorized the types of stress very well as a culture yet, and organized that it's not that stress is bad, but it's what kind of stress it is. Do you think that's true?
I think it's very true. I think stress can give a lot of energy. I mean, some stress can be bad, like indeed if it's imposed on you by a boss and you don't agree with him, but you still have to do it because he's your boss. And okay, that's kind of negative stress. It doesn't give you energy. But if it's self-imposed stress, as you said, participating to a competition, and that really gives energy. Absolutely, there's different kinds of stress, and the first kind of stress is indeed typically what leads to burnout. The stress that takes energy leads eventually to an empty battery and to a burnout. But the stress that I experienced doing Carbyon, for example, I mean, it gives energy, right? And we have our problems. So there are challenges on the technical side. There's challenges on financing things, and there's of course days that you think like, okay, nothing worked today, and yeah, you have of course fallbacks, but in a way, it's not draining my energy level, and I think it's something that everybody needs to really look for yourself. To what extent that what you do on a day-to-day basis is actually draining energy or giving energy, and you should of course avoid as much as you can anything that is draining energy, especially the mental energy. Then of course, and because indeed, if there is too much drainage of mental energy, sooner or later you run into a burnout. There is no escape, and the fact that so many people experience that means that there is something wrong with work culture, and with how we force people to work. One of the things, for example, that I maybe have an easy saying, because okay, I'm the CEO, so I decide. Okay, nobody decides what I have to do. But then I also put myself in the shoes of the employees, and I think like, okay, what do I have to do as a boss, so to speak, to avoid that they run out of mental energy? So I try also to give them a lot of freedom, and I'm really ambitious in terms of our goals, of course. I say, yeah, I want to do that XPRIZE, I want to run the machine in 2024, I want to do the 1,000 ton per year. But I tell them, like, if we fail, I'm not going to blame you, because I don't know if it's feasible. I'm not telling you to do it, and I will blame you if we can't. It's not going to be your fault. We just take a collective responsibility that we want to do it without knowing that we can do it. And if we fail, we're not going to blame one another. I'm not going to blame my people if we fail doing it, because if they feel like I make them responsible for the result, and that I will blame them for not achieving the result, that's negative energy. That's draining mental energy. They need to know that even though I'm extremely ambitious, that I will never blame them for not achieving these ambitions.
That's great. That sounds like a great work environment. Sounds like you're building something really cool. And again, your website says planet over profits. A simple phrase, but a powerful one. One that I wish more people adopted, because what is the spirit of that? And it's also, I think, people over profits, your team, the well-being of, if you have the choice of building this thing, why build it in a way that is negative? Why build it in a way that's not fun?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, I mean, I've now 35 years in business, I mean, doing different jobs, and it also helps me now to know what to do and what not to do. Also in terms of making sure that people feel well. I've been working in big corporates. I know what goes wrong in these big corporates. I know what type of, let's say, structures cause mental damage or drainage of mental energy. Um, so I've been there, and that experience helps me now to try and avoid doing that in Carbyon. Of course, it's different in a startup. It's easier probably in a startup. And we need to watch out that maybe if in 25 years from now we are ourselves a big corporate, imagine, that
Yes.
we have not
The worst
imported
nightmare.
the problems of big corporates. But for the time being, yeah, we try to respect these principles, so to make sure that everybody feels good, doesn't feel stressed in a negative way, and planet before profit. Also, we try to not just to have it as a slogan, but to also change our legal structure so that we can always make sure that the profits that we would generate will benefit the climate, and will not only benefit the shareholders. Shareholders, they need to get a fair compensation, of course, for the risk money which they provide. So there is no question about that. But the thing is that it should be fair. It should not be. It should be in proportion. And I think we've seen the last 20, 30 years that in many cases the compensation for, let's say, risk money was out of proportion, at the cost of environmental problems. Let's say society had to pay for the burnouts, for example, or things like that. So shareholders have become very rich, but it has happened at the cost of society. And I think this is what Planet Before Profit means. And we need to make sure that whatever we do as a company, as Carbyon, that we do not, let's say, that we respect the balance between the compensation for shareholders and these other goals that we have as a company. And we try to adjust our legal structure to that, so that there is a kind of ethical committee that can actually overrule shareholder decisions if that balance would be broken.
I think that's fabulous. And it's so important to do that because later, you can't do it later. You have to do it now. I think that's very wise. We have reached the end of our time here. I can't thank you enough for joining me, Hans. I think it's super cool what you're doing. I look forward to the next 1.5 years, the next couple years of progress. I will be watching very closely, but again, like I said, I have no doubt that you and your team will be able to do it. I think it's fabulous that you've done that. So thank you very much on behalf of all of us humans on this planet for attempting to solve our problems. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, and I hope we'll succeed. So thanks again for this nice talk, and let's keep in touch.
We definitely will. And of course, I can say, we can close it in Dutch. I can say, dankjewel and houdoe.